What's up, nerds? Taiwan is going to be an absolute nightmare for China to try to invade, and we're going to talk about why here in this video. There are three major reasons why Taiwan's going to be very difficult to invade that we're going to talk about today. One is going to be the size of forces involved, and another is going to be geography. And then the final reason is going to be the possible intervention by the United States and why China has to account for that. Each of these three issues play their own role, and we're going to dive into each and every one of them here today. Now, first, let's talk about the size of each forces, because the size of these forces involved in this fight, they're going to tell us a lot about the kinds of fight, or the kind of fight that we're going to be seeing, and it'll help kind of contextualize the next 2 points, that being geography and, the threat of a U.S. intervention. It'll help kind of contextualize the importance of those factors a lot here in just a moment. Now, first off, of course, the Taiwanese military has about 170,000 active duty personnel and a reserve force of about 1.6 million people. Now, that's pretty sizable. Taiwan has compulsory military service, meaning that everybody has to serve in the armed forces once they turn 18. And they have to serve at least 1 year in the military. And that's not really, that doesn't sound like a lot of time. Really, all that does is that gives everybody a base of training and just enough time in their unit to be able to, know the faces and know the names. So then whenever they go into civilian life, they can go do their own thing. And then should a war pop off, they can report to their unit. They know who they're with. They've already got some base of training. So all they really need is some amount of refresher training. And that really opens up for Taiwan. They have a huge pool of individuals that they can call up. And that's, that's beyond just that reserve number of 1.6 million. So they'll be on active duty for a time. They may choose to stay on active duty for a time. After active duty or, outside of active duty, they might choose to go into reserve time, where basically, they're kind of similar to here in the United States. They have a civilian career and a civilian life, but they're also part-time, with the armed forces. But then once they're separated from both of those, they're still kind of in this registry where they can get called up. So the numbers that we have here for active duty and reserve, it's not a complete number. Taiwan could call up any individual after they've left reserve status to fight in the armed forces should a war break out. So really that number could balloon by a pretty significant number should war happen. Now, technologically, the Taiwanese military is kind of a collection of old and new. They have F-16s. They also have domestically produced fighter aircraft. They also have a navy. And they have Patriot missile battery systems. And speaking of missiles, Taiwan has a lot of them. They're going to need a lot of them, and we're going to talk about why. Taiwan is not only buying different kinds of externally produced weapon systems, like Western produced systems, like they're purchasing harpoons from the United States and a contract over $1 billion that should be completed sometime around 2029. But domestically, they also produce their own cruise missile systems. Those can target both ships and land targets. Strategically, the goal for the Taiwanese military is to make the Strait of Taiwan as dangerous as possible for the People's Liberation Army Navy to traverse. And they have to impose as much cost on the Chinese military as they're transiting, so that way whatever forces they do manage to land on the beaches in Taiwan, they're not in the significant kind of force that China would like, and they increase the cost of sustaining that force that it's simply untenable. Now, of course, key targets for these anti-ship missiles will be China's aircraft carriers and troop transports and logistics ships, but it'll also be their destroyers and their cruisers and other kinds of naval ships that protect those ships. Now, that's the Taiwanese military, but what does China have to play with on their end? Well, looking at this conflict, right, and going by U.S. doctrine, that I could see this is not really exactly what Chinese doctrine has, as far as I'm aware, but as far as U.S. doctrine is concerned, when you're attacking a defensive force, you need to have at least a 3-to-1 attacker to defender ratio. For Taiwan to have 170,000 troops and about 1.6 million reservists, China is going to need to have a force of at least 510 active duty troops and 4.8 million reservists. Now, those are huge numbers. But for China, that's not that big of a deal, because on active duty, China has a little over 2 million active duty personnel. And on reserve status, which is much smaller by comparison, they have about 500 million. However, with China being an all-volunteer force, at least theoretically, they do have a draft, and they can call up a draft whenever needed. All males, similar to the U.S., once they turn 18, they need to register for the draft. And in case of war, China can call upon these individuals for service, and those numbers can balloon just to huge numbers. So China certainly has the personnel to fit this problem, and several other problems simultaneously. that's not a concern. But in the case of Taiwan, the concern becomes how exactly they're going to get to Taiwan. Assuming that they successfully land on Taiwan, and I think that that should be an uncontroversial statement, that Taiwan or that China will successfully manage to land on Taiwan, we now need to look at geography and what kind of hazards they're going to face that way, and how that will impact their ability to move forces around Taiwan and win the war. Well, first off, a key and obvious feature of Taiwan is that it's an island. It's 100 miles off the coast of China, and Taiwan faces typhoon season from April to November, which is a pretty significant slice of the year. And it's not like you can simply march your army, from China to Taiwan across a land border. There is no land border. So this conflict will be a naval war through and through. The Navy will have to secure the Strait of Taiwan, they'll have to secure a beachhead, and then they'll have to isolate the whole island of Taiwan and really the area from any kind of external interference, and also simultaneously support the army as it conducts its landings and as it sweeps through the island of Taiwan. Now, this will require a naval blockade. And we've seen China, demonstrate, the capability of a blockade of Taiwan in recent exercises where they've set zones on the other side of Taiwan where their Navy does exercises. But the effectiveness of the blockade, we'll just have to wait and see, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. But this will also require air and rocket strikes all across the island of Taiwan while this blockade is being enforced. Now, even once the beachhead is established, now that's all just to get the beachhead established. Even once the beachhead is established, you're going to have to reinforce and sustain that beachhead, and you're going to have to build up that force so it can then create offensive action, throughout the rest of the island. As an example, for D-Day in World War II, which this was not the largest amphibious invasion in terms of initial landing force in World War II, this involved over 7,000 ships. And Okinawa, which narrowly beat D-Day for the largest landing force in the war, included 2,500 ships. So these are a lot of ships that are required to successfully pull off these kinds of attacks. Now, China is on track to become the largest navy in the world. Their shipbuilding capacity is increasing drastically. They're able to roll off new ships pretty much every year in sufficient quantity. However, they're on track to have over 370 ships. So nothing to sniff at. I mean, again, these ships are not like World War II ships. Their capabilities are, they're able to see and shoot much farther than in World War II. But at the same time, we're talking about sustainment, they're going to have to requisition civilian ships, and that obviously balloons the amount of the number of ships that they're able to play with. But they're not going to be able to organically handle an amphibious invasion on their own. They're going to have to pull on civilian ships that are either Chinese flagged or owned by a Chinese company to transport Chinese soldiers and equipment across the Strait of Taiwan. Now this takes us back to geography and how. Let's say that, with all this being said, the strait issue is addressed. They're able to land a landing force. They've secured a beachhead. Now they've got to actually fight the fight and land more troops to sustain that fight. This is where the geography of Taiwan becomes a tremendous challenge. Taiwan is incredibly rugged. It's incredibly mountainous. It's in fact, the flatter area and the more populated area kind of covers the western coast of Taiwan facing China. But much of Taiwan is mountains. In fact, with the roads going through the mountains, there are nearly 30,000 bridges on Taiwan. And if these bridges are destroyed, they can pose a significant challenge for maneuver forces. So think your armored brigades, your infantry, brigades to move across the island. The incentive, of course, for China is to avoid destroying these bridges because for every bridge destroyed, that's just more bridging equipment that they're going to have to bring across the strait. That's going to slow their invasion of Taiwan, and they have to do all this very fast. And we're going to talk about why they have to do that very soon. And the incentive for Taiwan is to keep the bridges, up while they're there. But as the Taiwanese military retreats into the island, destroy the bridges, slow the Chinese advance, force them to stay on the opposite end of the gap. Fight across the gap and disrupt their ability to bridge these roads. Taiwan also has a significant amount of underground bunkers, metro systems, tunnels, even an underground airbase. And this grants the Taiwanese military protection not only from airstrikes, but also from aerial observation. It also, we've just talked about tunnels. A lot of these tunnels are for civilian use. So I'm including things like the metro system and underground malls and roadways in this, in the underground tunnel network. These can serve a purpose in peacetime, obviously. shopping centers. They can also serve a purpose in wartime, not only for protection of the civilian population, but also for the military. So it can have movement across the island or certain population centers. It can have protection from Chinese airstrikes as well. We've seen with the war in Gaza how important, how crucial tunnels can be in war, and how hard they can be for the invading force to handle. And it's not like, China can just flood these tunnels like the IDF can in Gaza. Many of these tunnels and underground facilities are well above seawater. Most of them in the mountains. So does Chinese PLA doctrine, mostly to remain enemy focused and not necessarily terrain focused. So their goal is to find, fix, isolate, and annihilate enemy forces, and that's what they're primarily focused on. Again, not necessarily with the securing of specific key terrain. Geography will pose a huge challenge, however, in isolating Taiwanese forces as long as they have access to these tunnels or underground facilities. China will have to consider this infrastructure and plan around it. And they have capabilities to try to damage some of this infrastructure. But again, for some of the deeper facilities, like the deeper bunkers, the deeper tunnels, that's going to be much, much harder for China to be able to handle. And again, for every single tunnel they encounter, for every destroyed bridge they encounter, this slows the invasion force down. And why speed matters in this conflict is because China is going to have to consider the risk of a U.S. intervention. We've talked before about U.S. strategic ambiguity around Taiwan and whether or not the U.S. will get involved in a war with Taiwan. Increasing U.S. investment and the presence of U.S. troops kind of indicates that the U.S. is not going to let Taiwan go easily. At the very least, they're going to invest as much as they can in Taiwanese defense up front, so that way if the U.S. does not intervene, then Taiwan is in a much better position to fight. Now, there's also U.S. forces all around Taiwan. To the north you have Japan, to the south you have the Philippines, and that allows the U.S. Lots of opportunities and lots of abilities to intervene in a war with Taiwan. The U.S. has multiple carrier strike battle groups. Obviously more than China, but you have the island of Okinawa, you have the Philippines, and those are basically unsinkable aircraft carriers as well. And they can accommodate much larger and heavier aircraft than what a carrier strike battle group can accommodate. Now it will be on the Chinese Navy to prevent, the United States from being able to access the island of Taiwan. If the US can access Taiwan, they can put supplies on the island, they can supply and replenish Taiwanese troops in the case of war. They can provide other kinds of assistance as well. So it will be on China to isolate the island of Taiwan. Again, this is Chinese doctrine. To isolate the island of Taiwan to prevent, U.S. subs from getting closely and infiltrating small, special forces teams to the island or other kinds of equipment. And to prevent aircraft from overflying the island. Again, dropping equipment or helping out and providing intelligence for Taiwan. Now, with all this being said, again, and we're going to talk about the flip side of this in a different video, and I'm going to talk about that here in just a moment. But China has plenty of capability to inflict a lot of pain on U.S. forces in the region. But again, this takes time, attention, and resources away from the fight on Taiwan. They're going to need everything that they can have and get, really, to fight on Taiwan and win it quickly. The goal is to strangle Taiwan pretty quickly in isolation and prevent anyone else like the U.S. from interfering. Now, the United States Navy is outnumbered in this theater, but it does nevertheless maintain significant capabilities, some of which China may not necessarily be able to match. Now, for instance, and we're talking now about a U.S. versus China fight, China would no longer be facing a much smaller military with much older tech like it would be in Taiwan. Now it would be facing the premier world superpower. With the most advanced fighter aircraft in the Navy in the world. And this is very clearly not the kind of fight that they want to be getting into. A larger protracted fight would be an absolute disaster for China. The economic isolation alone from a war like this would absolutely cripple the Chinese economy and cause huge challenges, some of them political long term. It's important to note as well that the Chinese military hasn't gained any kind of real world combat experience since the 1970s in Vietnam, and now they would be expected to fight and win a war against a military force that is a world superpower, maintains some capabilities greater than what China has, that basically gets real-world daily exercises for its morning workout routine. Now, at this point where the U.S. has intervened in the war in Taiwan, the war is escalating to a point where nobody wants it to go. The only way to end this war is for a Chinese withdrawal of Taiwan, and Of course, that is a non-starter for China at this point because they've invested so much, and it would be a huge black eye for the Chinese government. And the alternative to that for China would just be, dig in successfully to defend against U.S. intervention and succeed in taking Taiwan. Again, that's going to potentially be a longer fight. And now we're not even talking about Taiwan necessarily anymore. The focus for the Chinese military is now on the U.S. military, and then they can shift back to the war in Taiwan. This war would shift from just a war over Taiwan to a war over national survival, or at least the survival of the Communist Party. And that's how quickly a war over Taiwan could become an existential threat for the Communist Party. And this is why they have to tread and plan incredibly carefully for Taiwan. And that takes us to why I think that they're going to have to do all this incredibly quickly, and speed has to be the name of the game for a war over Taiwan. Their best bet is overwhelming military force and a successful invasion of Taiwan faster than the U.S. can respond, catching the U.S. off guard. Geography and the military size of both sides make this extremely challenging. There are so many considerations. We've already talked about geography. We've talked about how large the Taiwanese military is, and we've talked about the absolute risk that the U.S. military poses and its capability to intervene in this conflict. And this is why Taiwan is so hard to invade. Now, I'm going to make another video soon that will pair with this one on why Taiwan is so hard to defend, kind of analyzing this from the Chinese PLA perspective on what capabilities China has to play with, kind of the difficulties that Taiwan will have in defending the island, and the difficulties that the U.S. would have in intervening in a war like this, just to so we can get a holistic view of this conflict. But right now, I want to know what you think about this, so comment your thoughts down below, and like this video if you found it helpful or informative, and subscribe for that video as well, and subscribe for more analysis on other conflicts going on around the world as they happen. With all that, I'll see you all next time. Later.